Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to speak very briefly. First of all, I would like to speak as a filmmaker. I'm the producer of the film The Watermelon Woman, and if you haven't had an opportunity to see it, it's playing tonight at the Cubics at 6. And it's an important film to think about in relationship to our subject matter today because it's a film made 20 years ago by the director Cheryl Dunye, which is a self-reflexive film about archives. So the character, a Black lesbian filmmaker, looks to the archive of lesbians, looks to the archive of women, looks to the archive of Black people, and cannot find her own history. If you're not familiar with the film, I don't want to spoil what happens, but she plays, she, the filmmaker, she, the character, and we, the production team, create the archive that we need because that archive was not made for her. Now, interestingly, 20 years later, in relationship to this question about no future without a past, we're back at the Berlinale as part of the Teddy Retrospective because we have remastered our film. So we decided that our film was important to film history, and we worked very hard with a team of people to remaster our film, and we're offering it again to gay and lesbian and women's film festivals because we believe that the ideas that it expresses, the theoretical and political and personal ideas about archives, are as pertinent today as they were when we made it. But today, for the few minutes that I have, I'm actually going to speak as a scholar, not as the maker of that film, although the two are obviously very related. And I was asked to answer the question, who decides what we remember tomorrow? Now, initially one would think, well, that's quite obvious. And so let me say there are three answers to that question, quite obvious. And then I'm going to suggest, again, very briefly, that it's not as obvious as it thinks, that our politics and the relationships between our politics as scholars, as archivists, as filmmakers, and technology has changed the answers to these questions in a short period of time or a long period of time, depending on how you mark it, that I've been thinking about this as a scholar and a maker. So who decides what we remember tomorrow? Three brief answers. The first is, well, obviously, those who have cameras decide. So Okwe Enwazor, the curator and theorist, wrote in his notes for the program Archive Fever, uses of the document in contemporary art, quote, "The camera is literally an archiving machine. Every photograph, every film is a priori an archival object." So that is to say, anyone who has a camera is engaged in the technological project of producing and working within an archival machine. When we made The Watermelon Woman 20 years ago, women, lesbians, Black people had not been archived, were not available in the archive because they had not had access to cameras. We had not had access to cameras. And so if you looked in archive, there weren't photographs, there weren't films because we had not made our own images and people were not interested, men, in making images about us. But this has changed. 20 years later, everyone, many people, have access to iPhones. iPhones have cameras in them. This technological shift is profound if you think that the making of history is made by those who have cameras. And this is an exciting moment that many of us have anticipated for most of our lives. It's in front of us. What human beings do with those cameras, what feminists do with those cameras, what lesbians do with those cameras, what Black people do with those cameras is another matter. And this is where our activism needs to be now. Two, question I've asked, who decides what we remember tomorrow? People with cameras, one. Two, those in power and their authorized archivists. So the state, its secretaries, its festival directors, its curators. As we all know, Derrida writes, there's no political power without control of the archive, if not of memory. Effective democratization can always be measured by this essential criterion: the participation in and the access to the archive, its constitution, and its interpretation. So as we all know, historically, women, gays and lesbians, and our trans allies people of color, did not have that level of authority. And so we didn't own, make, direct archives. But again, when we made the Watermelon Women 20 years ago, when Cheryl, the character, who's a real person, Cheryl Dunier, looked to archives, her history was not there because women and people like her had never been in charge of archives. But again, I would have to say 20 years later, that has changed. That has changed because of our activism, of the women's movement, of gay and lesbian movement, of civil rights movement. There are many women like myself who now, and you, who run organizations, often state organizations, universities. We are controlling archives because of the activism of people before us, but also because of the internet, because of a technological shift, which is to say that online databases are wildly available to anyone who wants to make one and anyone who wants to access them. And it's completely changed the politics of the archive in ways that are profoundly important for those of us who are interested in histories of representation. So again, I feel like our activism is no longer about access or production, but about what happens inside of these radically available spaces. The third answer, and my last, to the question I was asked to address, which was, who decides what we remember tomorrow? People with cameras, people who run archives, historians and critics who produce the body of writing and thinking and passion around the objects that are made and then reside in archives. In this, here I quote Foucault, quote, "The analysis of the archive then involves a privileged region, at once close to us and different from our present existence. It is the border of time that surrounds our presence, which overhangs it and which indicates its otherness. It is that which outside ourselves delimits us." When we made the Watermelon Woman 20 years ago, there was no writing about women in film, a very small amount. No writing about Black women in film, very little writing about lesbians and gay people in film, because critics had not yet done this work. 20 years later, it has been done. There's a rich, lively body of writing and thinking, which younger scholars, younger people interested can access. We have this history. And so, again, our activism within the academy and as critics, as film critics, has been profound. And I think very exciting. But what the internet has brought us is fans. And fans now write and think in the most exciting and important ways about culture. And they are leading us, us scholars, us filmmakers. They're talking about our work. They're producing exciting ways to think about it. This is a really important change in culture. And again, we need to learn from our fans and work with our fans as academics, as filmmakers, as curators, and all of the roles that people take here. So I end by saying my question, which I keep forgetting, but it is an important one. Who decides what we remember tomorrow? We all do. We artists, we archivists, we curators, and we use the technology at hand, which is liberating us in ways none of us had imagined 20 years ago, to produce the archives we need. So I end with a quote from Catherine Lord, who's a lesbian artist in the United States. "Culture requires memory. Memory requires an archive." And I say, we are the people who produce the archives that we need so that we can live in history and memory. Thank you very much.